All right, everyone. We are going to have our second lecture on Out of the Silent Planet, and I spent a little bit too much time doing background material last time, so I'm going to try and press through so that we don't get behind on the course. So I wanted to start off by emphasizing some of the themes that I'm going to talk about in general by specific reference to the text, which I've already alluded to in foregoing lectures, and that's why we did Frankenstein and First Men in the Moon and so forth, but I just want to re-emphasize them. One is the evils of social engineering. In the name of furthering humanitarian endeavor, those that would orientate the modern world to fit those ambitions, to make society more suitable, humane. There's a great deal of social engineering going on, whether that's through the means of propaganda, or whether it's that is education, or whether it is through actually experimentation, those sorts of things, which are happening throughout the 20th century. The second one, and this becomes particularly clear in some of the passages that we'll look at here, is the the absurdity of racism. And in particular, the tenets of social Darwinism, which are so popular and common in Lewis's day. And we see this in Out of the Silent Planet in the division of the various creatures of this planet, which are clearly distinct, and yet they share something in common, which is a moral nature. So their physical appearance differs, and yet they are all regarded as now rational beings. And rational beings, irrespective of the differences between them, have moral, both a moral, when we say a rational being, we're not just talking about their capacity for rational thought, we're talking about their capacity for moral reflection, for understanding good and evil, justice and injustice, a point that Lewis repeatedly makes in his works, in everything from Mere Christianity to the Abolition of Man. He calls it the Tao. It's a characteristic of all human culture across religions, and we would say, using our Darwinist language, across different races. For my part, I'm no biologist, but my understanding is that all the human family can trace its origins back to a mitochondrial Eve, and therefore there is only one race, and that's the human race. So the whole idea of races and racism is probably a mistaken category even. There are physical descriptions, yes, but within the human genome, the capacity to uncover and therefore to have the appearance of difference, and there are differences, but not significant, not with that change our human nature, but that the idea that there are different races, and therefore with the doctrine of the survival of the fittest, then begs the question of which of these races is the fittest, the best suited for the future, is inevitable. And from that then comes the world wars that will effectively try and foreclose or anticipate that future state where one of those races will survive and the others will not. So it's the absurdity of that, not just the iniquity, but the absurdity of the whole thing is what Lewis is seeking to present. He's not just making a moral argument, he's trying to demonstrate in his work how ridiculous it is, because laughter is a better weapon to fight against iniquitous doctrine than simply refuting it through argument. He also wants to, and this is another theme, he wants to show the limitations of human power. Even though it is clear that modern technology and the scientific worldview that brings everything under the dominion of reason and under our power has allowed for huge technological developments. There's no doubt about it, and things that were unimaginable in previous generations, such as me recording this lecture, which I can then throw up on the internet, which I'm going to do eventually, and for other people to see at any point in the world, now or in the future. This is an extraordinary thing. It allows the present moment to be effectively captured and seen at any point, anywhere. This is it's a sort of a magic. And he talks about it in those terms, technology as a sort of magic. And I talked about that book that talked about the scientism as the magician's twin. It's the magician's twin because the magician uses magic. And technology and scientism is its twin. There's a belief in the scientist and in the technologists, those that advance technology, the companies, Google, Apple, whatever you have. There's huge belief in their project to advance not just our society, but the whole of humanity, unquestioned almost. And I said to you, I think I've said it here, the Steve Jobs and his ilk won't let their children use the devices that most of you are glued to all the time, the iPads and the iPhones and so forth. They don't let their own kids use them, which ought to tell you something. Really. So they're happy to experiment on you, but they have sufficient awareness of the consequences of using devices on the psychology and human happiness of individuals that they're not going to allow their own children to use them. That ought to be warning enough to me. But there are limitations to the human power even. As powerful as they get, there are limits to that, and the lack of wisdom in using the technology, and here it's Weston and company that bring them up there, they're still blinded to their inabilities and unaware of the consequences of their actions, and that's demonstrated in these novels as well. So for all the appearance of scientific power and technological advance, these stories are quite happy and good at illustrating how short they fall from being able to control things as they would like. That will be consistent in Lewis's stories and also in Tolkien's. So the lust for power is not met by the actual reality of power. There's a limit to it. And that's encouraging, because it does seem like the modern scientific state is all-powerful and has very few critics, even. But there's a power outside of that. But that lust for power and the real development of control over life, and when we say life, we're not just talking about the natural world, which is characteristic of Baconian science. So knowledge is power, says Francis Bacon. That's Bacon that said that, which is echoed by modern educators, has been applied to human nature, its power over human nature, and its knowledge of human nature, or at least it claims to be. But I've said to you in my own book on the subject, it's impossible for us to know ourselves in the way that scientists claim. Because the scientists' claim is that it's objective knowledge. Well, you can't be objective about your own nature because you're the subject of the study. So you're caught up in this conflict of you're biased. So bias is only one of the things, but there are limitations to that. And they don't even acknowledge the problem. They try and, through a methodology, try and get rid of the conscious bias. But how about the subconscious or unconscious bias? The biases of race and class and nation and so forth. That there's much talk of that in our day. Those are legitimate, by the way. But the biggest bias is simply the bias of the sinner, who wants to present himself or herself as not subject to the problems of human nature, being finite and, above all, morally corrupt and rebellion against God. Another one, and this one is really interesting, the cosmic significance of individual choices. There's a great assertion throughout Lewis's stories, and even in Tolkien's, of the importance of just, never mind great powers or even nations or collectives, but of individuals making choices and doing the right thing. And remember I talked about the context of this for both of them, the world wars, and the sense of helplessness, which we still share. You know, what do my little choices matter to anything? How much more helpless must they've felt in the trenches while the bombs are exploding over their heads and their friends are dying all around them? What does it matter if I do the right thing here? It's no matter, but they assert it very strongly. It's not just that it does matter, it's of cosmic significance. And they believe that there are choices, by the way, individual choices. So there's an assertion of personal freedom, and the consequences are very significant. And we will see this in Lewis's trilogy in the person of Edwin Ransom. If he does not do the right thing, for which he's been called, but if he doesn't do it, we don't know what the consequences are, but they're incalculable. He presents it that way. And because he's our hero, we in turn have a sense of the importance of our own choices. It's asserted strongly. And the pressure to do the wrong thing is enormous, so he doesn't downplay that, but still. Finally, there is a fear of the alien, which is part of the product of the whole sci-fi genre. So something that's other than us, whether it's the body of the Frankenstein creature before it's created or even after, or if it's of the Martians and First Men in the Moon, this horror that something is different than us and that we can't come to terms with it. As a reflection, and I said this, as a reflection of our idea that this other is in some way related to God. That's the point. It's the sublime. It has all the aspects of terror. It's the unknown, the unknowable. Those are all in there. And that alienation goes to the point of even being alienated from our own bodies. So the rational, I said this last time, the encyclopedias of the 1930s, children's encyclopedias, portray humanity as a switchboard operator within the brain, and with the brain within the body, and that little disembodied self is us in our essential nature. So it's a very rational but disembodied sense of nature, and Lewis is going to confront that as well in his works. So when he finds himself here on this planet, he is on his own. Remember, he's run away. What we left off last lecture, around page 50. I think it was at the end of chapter 8, with him having run away from Weston and Divine because he thinks that they're going to sacrifice him to the native people, and that's what they think they're doing, by the way, as well. They're all deluded. That's not what he's been called there for. But he thinks it is, so he runs off. He's on his own, and he feels lonely, and he hugs his own body. His body is his companion, but it's his body as if it were something other than him. And that's because when we think of our bodies, we don't think of our bodies as anything other than something that we're separate from. It's the detached perspective. You can even think of your body as something that isn't you. It's a type of thing. It's a really weird way of thinking, by the way. So if somebody punches you in the nose, have they hit you? I've heard people say who are assaulted that as long as you can take your mind somewhere else and then it's not happening to you. Well, this is absurd. If you're assaulted, it's you that's being assaulted. It's not just something that you're attached to. Your body is a part of you. It's not all of you. That's true. If it were all of you, then materialism would be true. And when you died, there would be nothing left of you, right? Because the physical body decays, etc. So your soul and your body are distinct, but they're not separable. But the idea that they are separable and that you can look at your body and you can do things to your body, whether cutting it, which is a common thing in our day, or whether it's putting tattoos on it or putting piercings in it or transforming your sexual nature through all of these ideas that what you're doing is operating on a thing to conform it to your idea is an alienating thought. And I'm trying to gain power over it and control over it so that I have an attachment to my body. That's what's going on, I think, with transgenderism. As I said, it's just the latest manifestation of a common problem of alienation from our own nature. Lewis confronts that idea as well on this planet. He's hugging his own body, even refers it to at one point as brother ass, which probably doesn't make a lot of sense. An ass being a beast of burden, St. Francis of Assisi refers to his own body this way because it doesn't do what he wants it to do. He finds his physical nature sometimes lets him down. He gets tired. Or Paul the Apostle speaks of, the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak. He doesn't mean the body there per se, actually, but it's hard not to associate it with something other than us. Now, I said the problem of modern psychology is that it can't define what it's studying. What is the psyche? Is it your mind? Is it the brain? Is it your soul? What is that thing? Where is that thing? How does it relate to your body? Psychology has a real problem making that connection. In part because they can't agree amongst themselves what it is they're studying. Which I didn't mean to attack our friends studying psychology here. But this it's not just a problem in psychology, it's the same problem in anthropology and sociology. What is it that you're actually studying? You got to define it before you can say that you're presenting knowledge about it. The method is not going to solve your problem. So you can use all the methods you want, and that's at least leaning towards the problem of bias and subjectivity, but it doesn't solve the problem. It's just nodding in the direction. So we pick it up in chapter 9 with Ransom being woken by his thirst and talking to himself. Now, this is not it's not the first time, but it's certainly a significant instance when he's talking to himself. There's no one else to talk to. And he requires somebody to talk to. He's alone. And it's not good for man to be alone. And he feels like he's going crazy. Because he's afraid and he needs to talk to somebody, so he talks to himself. "Hello, Ransom." He stopped. What would he say? If only he hadn't lost his nerve, the Sorns would have killed him by now. Then he remembered with inexpressible relief that there was a man wandering in the wood. Poor devil. He'd be glad to see him. He would come up to him and say, "Hello, Ransom." He stopped, puzzled. No, it was only himself. It was Ransom. Or was he? Who was the man whom he had led to a hot stream and tucked up in bed, telling him not to drink the strange water? Obviously some newcomer who didn't know the place as well as he. But whatever Ransom had told him, he was going to drink now. He lay down on the bank and plunged his face in the warm rushing liquid. It was good to drink. It had a strong mineral flavor, but it was very good. He drank again and found himself greatly refreshed and steady. All that about the other Ransom was nonsense. He was quite aware of the danger of madness and applied himself vigorously to his devotions and his toilet. By his toilet, he just means hygiene here. Vigorously he applies himself. How come? He's taking care of his body. He recognizes the importance of his body because he has a sense of himself only within his head, within his thoughts. Suddenly his body becomes very important to him. He's not going to neglect it. It's his companion. Comes along with him. It's brother ass. Not that madness mattered much, because his brother. It's not just a alien thing. Not that madness mattered much. Perhaps he was mad already and not really on Malacandra, but safe in bed in an English asylum. If only it might be so. He would ask Ransom, curse it. There his mind went playing the same trick again. He rose and began walking swift. But so he objectifies himself, sees that person, Ransom, as somebody else. He can talk about him. People do that. They refer to themselves. Yes?
I find it interesting, like, it's almost like the Gollum character.
Yeah, there's a bit of Smeagol Gollum stuff going on. I think you're correct. You also find very popular figures, celebrities, talk about themselves in this way, in the third person. I've heard Justin Trudeau talk about this. I've heard many athletes talk about it. So there's the public figure of Justin Trudeau, of you name it, and they talk about themselves and call them that figure almost as if that person isn't them, and that's because it isn't to some degree. There's a public perception, a public persona. Very hard on the people concerned, actually. The word celebrities is from Kalis, the heavenlies. These are people that are seen almost as if they are not mortal people, and so when people meet them in public, they rush towards them, they want selfies. It must be a terrible thing. You know, people would like to be famous until they're famous, and then they wish they could be anonymous again. In part because of the camera technology. It creates a sort of a false perception of closeness, intimacy with somebody. I know that person because I've watched that person on TV over and over, and I know what you would say in this situation. I'm an actor. What do you mean, what I would say? The politician's also, I don't mean he's an actor, but a politician is taking on a certain role, and that's not the whole of the person. In the case of the Prime Minister, he's a father and family man, he's a husband, it's all these other roles. You don't know anything about that. You see him as doing what he does. Very challenging, and technology creates that problem. So your soul has been robbed from you in some ways. An aspect of you has been presented to others, which is certainly part of you, but it's not the whole of you. Now you got to live up to it. Furthermore, now he comes to a different creature, and this is one of the more interesting aspects. Page 55, so chapter 9. And he comes across a creature, and he's not quite sure what it is. And the creature does not look like a man. That's because it isn't. And there's a big black animal, and what it is, it's a Hrossa, which is it's a horse-like creature. And he sees it, and he sees it talking, and this is what blows his mind. I'll just read an extract. Then something happened which completely altered his state of mind. The creature, which was still steaming and shaking itself on the back, and had obviously not seen him, opened its mouth and began to make noises. This in itself was not remarkable. But a lifetime of linguistic study assured Ransom almost at once that these were articulate noises. Articulus is your index finger. They are pointing to something. The sounds are directing and identifying things. The creature was talking. It had a language. If you are not yourself a philologist, I'm afraid you must take on trust the prodigious emotional consequences of this realization in Ransom's mind. A new world he had already seen, but a new and extraterrestrial, a non-human language was a different matter. Somehow, he had not thought of this in connection with the Sorns, whom he was going to be sacrificed to. Now it flashed upon him like a revelation. The love of knowledge is a kind of madness. In the fraction of a second which it took Ransom to decide that the creature was really talking, and while he still knew that he might be facing instant death, his imagination had leapt over every fear and hope and probability of a situation to follow the dazzling project of making a Malacandrian grammar. An introduction to the Malacandrian language, the lunar verb, a concise Martian English dictionary. The titles flitted through his mind. And what might not one discovered from the speech of a non-human race. The very form of language itself, the principle behind all possible languages, might fall into his hands. As I said to you, the search for Adamic language in the Renaissance period was real. You sought to learn all manner of languages in the hope of an original language, and that language would be the language of Adam, which, if discovered, would be the language of knowledge of things in their essence. So it was a language with power and true knowledge. That was what they sought to recover. It's overcoming the consequences of the fall. That's what he thought he was finding here. So I can go to another planet or another species, and if I can identify it and compare it and contrast it with my own language, then maybe I can discover the principles of the language. Note he's thinking in terms of power as well, which we will find is impossible for people not to consider. Tolkien is going to talk about that in The Lord of the Rings. Human beings lust for power, part of their sinful nature. Unconsciously, he raised himself on his elbow and stared at the black beast. It became silent. The huge bullet head swung round, and lustrous amber eyes fixed him. There was no wind on the lake or in the wood. Minute after minute, in utter silence, the representatives of two so far divided species stared each into the other's faces. Ransom rose to his knees. The creature leapt back, watching him intently, and they became motionless again. Then it came a pace nearer, and Ransom jumped up and retreated. Not far, curiosity held him. He summoned up his courage and advanced, holding out his hand. The beast misunderstood the gesture. It backed into the shallows of the lake, and you could see the muscles tightened under its sleek pelt, ready for sudden movement. But there it stopped. It too was in the grip of curiosity. Neither dared let the other approach, yet each repeatedly felt the impulse to do so himself and yielded to it. It was foolish, frightening, ecstatic, and unbearable all in one moment. It was more than curiosity. It was like a courtship, like the meeting of the first man and the first woman in the world. It was like something beyond that. So natural is the contact of sexes, so limited the strangeness, so shallow the reticence, so mild the repugnance to be overcome, compared with the first tingling intercourse of two different but rational species. So it's like the first man and the first woman, but the first man and the first woman are both man, right? Male, female, the two together are man. But these are different. They are rational species, and yet they're not man. This is clearly something that is not man, and yet still rational. So that there's the comparison of the human analogy is there, but it's only the analogy of Adam and Eve, which we can only imagine. And now it's going beyond that even. It's a rational creature. And then the creature suddenly turned and began walking away. A disappointment like despair smote Ransom. "Come back!" he shouted in English. The thing turned, spread out its arms, and spoke again in its unintelligible language. Then it resumed its process. It had not gone more than 20 yards away when Ransom saw it stoop down and pick something up. It returned in its hand. He was already thinking of its webbed forepaw as a hand. Note that he's now anthropomorphizing this creature because it has a rational nature, so he has to think of things with rational natures as human, which is interesting because we're going to find out that not all rational natures are human. Humans are in fact only one thing that has rational natures. What else is a rational nature which is not human? Angels and God have rational natures, but they're not human. But he's never considered that. The modern scientist thinks that man is a rational animal, but there are no other rational beings besides man. So this is a part of a way of course, getting rid of that bias. And it holds up a shell, and basically and then it squirts something out of its front. He thought it was a is generally peeing in the cup. And then he realized that he had some sort of, I don't know, pack on him that allowed him to squirt it, and then he's going to drink it. So he's offering hospitality of some sort. Extraordinary. Reflections on this in chapter 10. Second paragraph. Having got into the boat with the Hrossa, he proceeded to get out again and then pointed to it. Ransom understood that he was being invited to follow his example. The question which he wanted to ask above all others could not, of course, be put. Were the Hrossa, he discovered later that this was the plural of Hross, the dominant species on Malacandra? And the Sorns, despite their more man-like shape, merely a semi-intelligent kind of cattle? Remember the moon calves? And he's assuming if there's one creature on this planet that has reason, it must be the dominant creature. So what were those? Because things with reason always exercise dominance over other things, and they must be sub-rational. Why would he assume that? Well, because that's the conditions of our world. He's going to make all sorts of other assumptions. Fervently, he hoped that it might be so that the Sorns were the semi-intelligent one, because he was terrified of the Sorns, because remember, he was going to be sacrificed to them. Whereas these are the rational ones, maybe this one will be benevolent. On the other hand, the Hrossa might be the domestic animals of the Sorns, because one looks like a man, more man-like, and the other looks more animal-like. So they must be even more intelligent. What does that mean then? The Hrossa might be the domestic animals of the Sorns, in which case the latter would be super intelligent. His whole imaginative training, note that phrase, his whole imaginative training somehow encouraged him to associate superhuman intelligence with monstrosity of form and ruthlessness of will. His whole imaginative training. The more rational, the more monstrous. Where would he get that thought from? Experience in life, also from the science fiction novels. This is an imaginative training. Remember, Lewis is writing a book here that wants to subvert or upend the apple cart here to get people to imagine differently. It doesn't have to be this way, the way you've imagined it. Space doesn't have to be empty. There can be a God, and the God can be benevolent. Human beings are not puppets without wills. They can resist. They can do good things. Their choices matter. It's not this terrible, despairing portrait of life, this dystopian portrait of the future, which most sci-fi writers are presenting. But he's terrified. To step on board the Hrossa's boat might mean surrendering himself to Sorns at the other end of the journey. On the other hand, the Hrossa's invitation might be a golden opportunity of leaving the Sorn-haunted forests forever. And by this time, the Hrossa itself was becoming puzzled at his apparent inability to understand it. But note, he associates superhuman intelligence with monstrosity. So when we looked at Frankenstein, we have the Frankenstein creature, but he's not the monster of Frankenstein. Frankenstein, the scientist, is. He's the real. So it's a way of dealing with life and an attitude towards it, an alienating attitude towards life, a detached and isolated attitude towards life, a distancing from rational and moral consequences, and above all, a distancing of the need to love things. That is the problem. And Frankenstein is marked by all those things. He's alienated himself. He's seen himself as if he were an orphan, and thereby has made himself an orphan. Everybody around him dies. A consequences of his self-centered actions, which he thought were humanitarian. But we, as readers, see are not humanitarian at all. They're just totally destructive. This is a critique of a whole imaginative approach to life that emerges in the Romantic period and stays with us. As I say, the orphan as the hero for us to model ourselves upon, not follow other people's ideas of us, not follow any religious viewpoints, but to look within inside ourselves and to discover the truth of our own nature. He's trying to overthrow that imaginatively here. Then he moves on, and I'm just hopping around and trying to address things that struck me as interesting. With a cultural analysis, and this is very interesting because, again, as I say, the modern social sciences create many new ways of looking at the world which were unknown in the past. One of them is anthropology, the study of man. Anthropos is Greek word for man, the study of man throughout history. Anthropology. He does a cultural analysis. And I'll begin in it's chapter 11, the second paragraph. Of the community in general, his earlier impressions were all gradually being corrected. His first diagnosis of their culture was what he called Old Stone Age. The few, because they're technologically not very sophisticated, the few cutting instruments they possessed were made of stone. They seemed to have no pottery, but a few clumsy vessels used for boiling, and boiling was the only cookery they attempted. Their common drink, vessel, dish, and ladle, all in one, was the oyster-like shell in which he had first tasted Hrossa hospitality. The fish which it contained was their only animal food. Vegetable fare they had in great plenty and variety, some of it delicious. Even the pinkish-white weed, which covered the whole handramit, was edible at a pinch. So if he had starved before Hrossa had found him, he would have starved amidst abundance. Yes, he wasn't sure. It could be poisonous. Well, in this world there is no poison. It's not a fallen world. But he didn't know that at the time. No Hrossa, however, ate the weed. Honodras crude for choice, though it might be used faute de mieux on a journey, lacking better. Their dwellings were beehive-shaped huts of stiff leaf in the villages. There were several in the neighborhood, were always built beside rivers for warmth and well upstream towards the walls of the handramit, where the water was hottest. They slept on the ground. They seemed to have no arts except a kind of poetry and music which was practiced almost every evening by a team or troop of 4 Hrossa. One recited, half chanting at great length, while the other 3, sometimes singly and sometimes antiphonally, so in a chorus, one singing back to the other, interrupted him from time to time with song. Ransom could not find out whether these interruptions were simply lyrical interludes or dramatic dialogue arising out of the leader's narrative. He could make nothing of the music. The voices were not disagreeable and the scale seemed adapted to human ears, but the time pattern was meaningless to his sense of rhythm. Then he goes on, and at the end of this, and I'll skip on 2 paragraphs, but the real revolution in his understanding of the Hrossa began when he had learned enough of their language to attempt some satisfaction of their curiosity about himself. In answer to their questions, he began by saying that he had come out of the sky. Remember, he thinks he's speaking to people from a Stone Age. I fell from the sky. In answer to their questions, Hrossa immediately asked him from which planet or earth, Handra. Ransom, who had deliberately given a childish version of the truth in order to adapt it to the supposed ignorance of his audience, so he assumes because they are using these utensils that they lack an intellectual maturity, which he has, so he's looking down on them. He was a little annoyed to find that Hrossa painfully explaining to him that he could not live in the sky because there was no air in it. He might have come through the sky, but he must have come from a handra, that is a world. He was quite unable to point Earth out to them in the night sky. They seemed surprised at his inability, and repeatedly pointed out to him a bright planet low on the western horizon, a little south of where the sun had gone down. He was surprised that they selected a planet instead of a mere star, and stuck to their choice. Could it be possible that they understood astronomy? Unfortunately, he still knew too little of the language to explore their knowledge. He turned the conversation by asking them the name of the bright southern planet, and was told that it was Malacandra, the silent world or planet. Why do you call it Thulk? He asked. Why silent? No one knew. The Saroni knew. No, said Nora. That is the sort of thing they know. Then he asked Then he was asked how he had come, and he made a very poor attempt at describing the spaceship. But again, the Saroni would know. Had he come alone? No, he had come with 2 others of his kind, bad men. Bent men was the best or nearest Hrossian equivalent who had tried to kill him, but he ran away from them. The Hrossa found this very difficult, but all finally agreed that he ought to go to Oyarsa. Oyarsa would protect him. Ransom asked who Oyarsa was, and slowly and with many misunderstandings, he hammered out the information that Oyarsa, 1, lived in Meldalorn, 2, knew everything and ruled everyone, 3, had always been there, and 4, was not a Hross, not one of the Saroni. Then Ransom, following his own idea, asked if Oyarsa had made the world. So is this a god figure? The Hrossa almost barked in the fervor of their denial. Did people in Malacandra not know that Mal-Eldil the Young had made and still ruled the world? So Mal-Eldil being Jesus, by the way, Mal-Eldil the Young. Did they not know this? Even a child knew that. Where did Mal-Eldil live? Ransom asked. With the Old One, the Ancient of Days. And who was the Old One? Ransom did not understand the answer. He tried again. Where was the Old One? He is not that sort, said Nora, that he has to live anywhere, and proceeded to a good deal which Ransom did not follow. So he's describing gods don't have age. They don't, right? He's Ancient of Days, but he's not subject to time. He's not like that. He doesn't have a place, and he's not in the same. This is an accommodation to our language and our terms of reference. Very interesting. Then comes the key point. He is not Hnau. He was a spirit without body, parts, or passions. He is not Hnau, said the Hrossa. What is Hnau? You are Hnau. I am Hnau. The Saroni are Hnau. The Fifiltree are Hnau. Fifiltree? said Ransom. More than 10 days' journey to the west. The Handra sinks down, not into a Handramet, but into a broad place, an open place, spreading every way, and there's another type of creature, a third type of creature. And all of these are Hnau. But Oyarsa rules. Is he Hnau? This puzzled them a little. The Saroni, they thought, would be better at that kind of question. Perhaps Oyarsa was Hnau, but a very different Hnau. He had no death and no young. It's a creature of some sort, but not of their sort. Other thing, very interesting here. He had no death and no young. They do. They're unfallen, and yet they will die. Yeah. He doesn't expect that. Yes?
By having no young, does it mean they doesn't have children? Or does
yes.
It mean they isn't young?
No, the former. He has no children. There's no procreation. Which is not to say that he has no sex, as in sexual nature. there's a maleness and a femaleness, which he's going to discuss as well, which is also interesting. So he's saying that maleness and femaleness are a part of our nature, irrespective of the use to which it's put. The whole world is either masculine or feminine in some way. Boy, that'll make the gender theorists crazy. It goes on at the end of this chapter 11. Naturally, his conversations with the Hrossa did not all turn on Malacandra. He had to repay them with information about the Earth. He was hampered in this both by the humiliating discoveries which he was constantly making of his own ignorance about his native planet. Remember, this is a professor at Cambridge, eminent in his field, regarded as a world expert in his area. So he's a man renowned for his knowledge, but he's ignorant of the most basic things of common life because he's a specialist. He's a Fachidiot. Right? He knows a great deal about this, but he doesn't know much about many things. Like, I'm one of those people. I try my best, but I'm not practically particularly useful. I can't fix my car. Actually, nobody can fix their car anymore. But they used to be able to, and you can do it mechanically. Now everything's a chip, right? Something goes wrong, you got to take it in the garage and they fix it with a chip. But you used to be able to actually repair a car. Anyway, but he has no. He's hampered and humiliated by his own ignorance about his native planet, and partly by his determination to conceal some of the truth. And the reason this is humiliating is they are astounded that he does not even have a childlike knowledge of some basic things, which he probably would have been taught in school but ignored. Anyway, he did not want to tell them too much of our own human wars and industrialisms. He remembered how H.G. Wells' Cavour met his end on the moon, also because he's still afraid of them. The more he learns about his lack of knowledge, the more he thinks that these creatures are his superior, and if his superior, he's afraid of what the consequences for him will be. Because whatever is superior in our world abuses what's inferior. Power exercises it in a malevolent way. Not always, but sometimes. And when they find out about what our human race is like, what are they going to do? A sensation akin to that of physical nakedness came over him whenever they questioned him too closely about men, or the Chmana, as they called them. However, he was determined not to let them know that he'd been brought there to be given to the Sorns, for he was becoming daily more certain that these were the dominant species. What he did tell them fired the imagination of the Hrossa. They all began making poems about the strains of Handra, where the plants were hard like stone, and the earth weed grew green like rock, and the waters cold and salt. The manna lived out on top on the Harandra. They were even more interested in what he had to tell them of the aquatic animal with snapping jaws, which he had fled from their own world and even in their own Handramit. It was a Hanakra. They all agreed. They were intensely excited. The youth of the Hrossa got out their weapons, primitive harpoons with points of bone, and the very cubs began playing at Hanakra hunting in the shallows. Some of the mothers showed signs of anxiety, wanted the cubs to be kept out of the water, but in general the news of the Hanakra seemed to be immensely popular. So now this is a beast that will kill them, and they are going to hunt it and do a heroic deed. And then they're going to sing about it. So this is a culture, these are the poets of this world, the Hrossa. They live heroic lives, and their whole purpose in life is to take delight and to capture heroic ideals. But they are the best poets. We're going to find that the Soroni are the scientists. The Fifiltrigi are the engineers. There's an analogy, by the way, between these three creatures and the three creatures we meet in Middle-earth. The elves will be like the Saroni. The dwarves like the Fifiltrigi. And the hobbits, the poets. All rational creatures. That's a fallen world, however, Tolkien's world. So there's enmity between them and so forth. Whereas here there isn't. And that's interesting. So they're doing different things. They're not, the two men's take on these issues is not the same. They're similar, but not the same. But very surprised that he's very surprised that there are three rational, yet cooperating creatures. They're not trying to kill each other. They're not trying to exert dominance and eradicate one another. Social commentary, which is characteristic of science fiction in general. But no, he projects a possible world in which rationality exists without malice, thereby showing us that rationality is not in and of itself a good, which science fiction presents it as. Not quite. Frankenstein is very skeptical of this, demonstrates its malice. But showing that evil and the problem of evil is something different than that. It can't be solved by scientific rationality or simply by Mary Shelley's portrait of love. We just need to love one another and write poetry, and it goes much deeper than that problem. So he's shocked by this. He wants to know, as I say, if Oyarsa is a now, and he assumes that the Saroni are the intelligentsia of the world, and therefore the dominant creature, and thereby to be feared. And then he finds out about Oyarsa, and now he's even more. So when he hears about Oyarsa, and Oyarsa is in charge, this is the creature that I must fear. A fear of authority. Why? There's no empirical basis for him to fear Oyarsa, but he does. Why? Sure.
It's because he assumes that someone with power will want to exert their will over his.
And will not have his best interests at heart. Yeah. And why would he assume that? Because it's always the case. Or often the case. Right? So it's projection. Again, these are imaginative ways of making us question our very core assumptions, and the core assumptions about things actually guide us in how we perceive them even. And for a Christian, one cannot look at life as implacably in its nature hostile to us and still believe in a benevolent God, let alone an omniscient, omnipotent one. This is impossible. So you've got to get rid of the idea, or at least hold it in tension, the idea that God might be angry at us. Yes, of course. But in the end, is there not good behind that? Of course. But you can only get under that by saying there are instances when authority is exerted and it's not hostile. To be sure, there are many that are, but there are many that are not. We have to trust in something outside of ourselves. And if we don't, we're going to give people the power, i.e. scientists, or the state the power to do it benevolently. And that's far worse. Then he encounters something right at the end of chapter 11, which is he's not encountered thus far, and he sees something that's almost impossible to see. It's an Eldil, something like an angel. Right at the end of chapter 11. On the way, where the path was single and Ransom was following Hrossa, they pass a little she-Hrossa, not much more than a cub. She spoke as they passed, but not to them. Her eyes were on a spot about 5 yards away. "Who do you speak to, Hriki?" said Ransom. "To the Eldil." "Where? Did you not see him?" "I saw nothing." "There, there!" she cried suddenly. "Ah, he's gone. Did you not see him?" "I saw no one." "Hyoi," said the cub, "the man cannot see the Eldil." But Hyoi, continuing steadily on his way, was already out of earshot and had apparently noticed nothing. Ransom concluded that Hriki was pretending like the young of his own species. In a few moments he rejoined his companion. Well, this is not the last time we're going to meet an Eldil. One is going to come directly to Hyoi and tell Hyoi to do something shortly hereafter. Before he does this, let's talk about sex. Now everyone needs to ears perk up. There you go. So right at the beginning of 12. Did Saroni and Hrossa and Fifiltrigi ever go out like that with weapons against each other? What for? Asked Hyoi. It was difficult to explain. If both wanted one thing and neither could give it, said Ransom, would the other at last come with force? Would they say, "Give it or we will kill you"? What sort of thing? Well, food perhaps. If the other now wanted food, why should we not give it to them? We often do. But how if we had not enough for ourselves? But Mal-Eldil will not stop the plants growing. Hyoi, he's so frustrated. How, if you had more and more young, would Mal-Eldil broaden the Handramit and make enough plants for them all? Where does the question come from? Thomas Malthus, early 19th century English clergyman, the fear that the earth would not be able to contain all of humanity and it needed to be controlled, population control. Because we were going to exhaust the earth's riches, and he projected all manner of nightmare scenarios where there would be mass starvation, etc. So we need to control the population.
How do you spell that last name, Professor?
Malthus, Malthus, Thomas Malthus. What's the scenario? The fearful scenario of starvation and war and so forth that will come from the shortage of goods on Earth. He's seeing that there's an expansion of the European powers into all the world, and the population is growing. It's grown since then. Still used to this day, this scenario.
And that was the 19th century?
Early 19th century, Thomas Malthus, look him up. So if you had more and more young, would Mal-Eldil broaden the Handramit and make enough plants for them all? The Saroni know that sort of thing. But why should we have more young? That's a different way of putting it. Ransom found this difficult, because he's never thought of it as why should we have more, but why should we not curtail? Why should we? At last he said, is the begetting of young not a pleasure among the Hrossa? A very great one, man. This is what we call love. Okay. If a thing is a pleasure, a man wants it again. He might want the pleasure more often than the number of young that could be fed. It took Hyoi a long time to get the point. You mean, he said slowly, that he might do it not only in 1 or 2 years of his life, but again? Yes. But why? Would he want his dinner all day, or want to sleep after he had slept? I do not understand. But a dinner comes every day. This love, you say, comes only once while the Hross lives? They have sex once their whole life. And then it explains, but it takes his whole life. When he is young, he has to look for his mate. And then he has to court her. Then he begets young. Then he rears them. Then he remembers all this and boils it inside him and makes it into poems and wisdom. But the pleasure he must be content only to remember? That's like saying, my food I must be content to eat. I do not understand. A pleasure is full grown only when it is remembered. It's part of the whole event. There's the courtship, whatever. Note that sex has been presented as a bodily need. And it's a bodily need that needs to be exercised as regularly as you have to eat. This is biologically not true at all. Historically, sex would be, again, restricted to the marital confines. And chastity is the right attitude towards your spouse even within marriage as well as outside of marriage. Chastity governs them both. So the way in which we view sex as a bodily need that we must express at every point without any hedges is another thing that he needs to overturn in his thoughts. And he does it by putting it in the words of the Hrossa, but they don't use sex this way. In fact, sex is so important and such a great thing that they spend their whole lives preparing for that event, and then they talk about it ever thereafter. They have the children, and then they also compose poetry. And so, in fact, everything is about that. So it happens once. This is just Lewis imaginatively looking at the way we look at sex, which is, I think, fascinating. Tolkien doesn't get into any of that stuff. So it's only full grown when it is remembered. You are speaking, man, as if the pleasure were one thing, detached, and the memory another. It's all one thing. The Saroni could say it better than I say it now. Not better than I could say it in a poem. What you call remembering is the last part of the pleasure, as the craw is the last part of a poem. When you and I met, the meeting was over very shortly. It was nothing. Now it is growing something as we remember it, but still we know very little about it. What it will be when I remember it as I lie down to die, what it makes in me all my days till then, that is the real meeting. You just think about that as a way of looking at life. You know, when did we met? We met this, yeah, but now there's all of the years of friendship and acquaintance and so forth, and you know the person much more deeply and intimately. You've shared travails together, shared experiences. You're transformed. But so that point of meeting, that's just the beginning of the relationship, but there's a relationship that it's a fascinating way of looking at it. But it's really a holistic way of looking at it, as opposed to the detached way of looking at pleasure as this thing, sex as this thing, family as this thing, society, like all of them separated and detached and no unity. So again, Lewis is imaginatively constructing on an unfallen world a more healthy way of looking at it than the one that has become common in his day. So now you do sex ed. And sex ed means sex not just with marriage and love. In fact, there's no discussion of love or marriage in the sex ed curricula anymore. And it will be sex with all manner of things in any context. Is this not an alienating way of looking at sex? Yes, but it's education. And it's modern. So if it's modern, it must be better, because it's contemporary, right? And you consider the role of technology. Well, we didn't have that 30 years ago like that, so of course, sex has changed then. Oh, really? I mean, it has, but in another sense, of course it has not in its essence and its importance. And this is, the perspective here is a very interesting one on that front. So separating sex from propagation, from family, from meaning, from the poetry written about it. Just think of all the poetry that's written about love. Just think of it all. So pleasure and memory are not separated. They are part of a unified consciousness and a unified, meaningful, holistic perception of it. And Lewis is recommending that unified perspective. He's not saying you only have to have sex once. That's not his point. But having a holistic view of everything, putting it on planet Malacandra is a way of his addressing what we do and the way we think about such things. And I think he does a very admirable job of it. Then he goes on to there are two types of longing. This is the continuation of the same discussion. You say you have poets in your world. Do they not teach you this? That love is all of these things connected. Perhaps some of them do, said Ransom. But even in a poem, does a Hrossa never long to hear one splendid line over again? We do in our poems. We quote a particularly memorable line. Hyoi's reply, unfortunately, turned on one of those points in their language which Ransom had not mastered. There were two verbs, which both, as far as he could see, meant to long or yearn. But the Hrossa drew a sharp distinction, even in opposition, between them. Hyoi seemed to him merely to be saying that everyone could long for it, wandalone, but no one in his senses could long for it, hlunathaline. And indeed, the poem is a good example, for the most splendid line becomes fully splendid only by means of all the lines after it. If you went back to it, you would find it less splendid than you thought. You would kill it. I mean, in a good poem. But in a bent poem, Hyoi, a bent poem is not listened to, man. And how of love in a bent life? How could the life of a now be bent? Do you say, Hyoi, that there are no bent Hrossa? Hyoi reflected. I have heard, he said at last, of something like what you mean. It is said that sometimes here and there a cub of certain age gets strange twists in him. I have heard of one that wanted to eat earth. There might perhaps be something like where a Hrossa likewise that wanted to have the years of love prolonged. I've not heard of it, but it might be. I have heard of something stranger. There is a poem about a Hrossa who lived long ago in another Handramit who saw things all made, two suns in the sky, two heads on a neck, and last of all, they say, he fell into such a frenzy that he desired two mates. I do not ask you to believe it, but that's the story, that he loved two Hresni. You don't have to believe this, but there were two. My goodness. Unimaginable. Ransom pondered this. Where? Here, unless Hyoi was deceiving him, was a species naturally continent, naturally monogamous, and yet was it so strange? So it strikes him. Again, social scientists talk about humanity. It's not natural to be monogamous. Blah blah blah. You've heard all the garbage. Social scientists spout this all the time. It's not natural. What do you mean by natural? Begs the question. Whenever you hear the word natural being used, what do they mean by this? Anyway, he'll go on in that. I need to. I'm noticing the time. I will move on here. But they are monogamous, like the lower animals on earth, Ransom notes. Why do we regard these animals as lower? Again, Ransom is making a great deal of assumptions, so those are just his cultural assumptions, the biases that let him look at things in a certain way. There's no reason why they ought to be that way, and if you thought about it, it wouldn't make a great deal of sense. But he's told to, at the end of, or at the beginning of chapter 13, to go. The Eldil orders Ransom to go to Oyarsa. He speaks to Hyoi. He has to go to Oyarsa. And then they see a Hnakra, the things that they long to hunt for. They spend their whole lives waiting to find one of these things, and then it's just like sex, right? It's a one-off event. It's not, there are other Hnakra, but you're waiting your whole life to be able to get one of these things, and when you fight it, it might kill you, because it's such a great foe. But if you kill it, you'll be able to boast of it forever, and you'll sing songs about it, and it's the highlight of your life. It's an adventure. And so he sees it. He's been told, do this. But he sees this, and the two of them say, let's go get the Hnakra right now. So he doesn't obey. And then he gets killed. Hyoi gets shot, as it turns out. But he's killed the Hnakra. So his last words are Hyoi Hnakrapunti, the Hnakra killer. dies in a sense happily, but he dies disobedient. He wouldn't have been killed. But he is killed, and he's shot by Weston. Yes?
In that whole transaction, wasn't it like, I think it was Floyd had said to Ransom, we have to go.
We have
now,"
got to go.
And he doesn't go, and then he's
Joy
like, "No."
goes along with him.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I found that really interesting to
Yeah.
see that he knew that they had to listen to the ill will.
Yes?
And then he got distracted by.
He got distracted because he really wanted to, but of course he knew he had to obey, and he would have obeyed, but he's led astray by Ransom, who's used to something. But you waited your whole life. It's right there. And what is this Eldil? And you've got to obey what? Okay, well, we'll do that after. This is an important point. Repeatedly in the sci-fi trilogy, the importance of obedience and immediate obedience to God without even knowing the outcome or why is vital. So when you know that God has spoken, not that he's ever called God, then you must obey, and you must do it immediately. He's going to learn to do that over time. Again, this is part of his development as a character. It's part of what I said last time about the nature of these novels. They're Bildungsroman to some degree. So the character is transformed in his knowledge, but also in his character to become obedient and useful in the battle against all of the things that blight the world of his day. So he will become a great and mighty man, mighty through his willingness to obey. And against his own best counsel. So I'll skip over that, but he is killed, and then he goes on anyway. And he goes on with the Saroni. And then he expresses his fears about Oyarsa in chapter 14, because again, he imagines him as a god and an idol that the Sorns want him to sacrifice to, because the Sorns, being like our creatures, this is what humans do in religions. They sacrifice people even to gods. And there's a lot of internal monologue there. And he finally meets a Sorn by the name of Augray, A-U-G-R-A-Y, and Augray takes him on upward. And then he describes something which I won't spend too much time in chapter 15. He describes what a body is like. So he's describing an Eldil. I can't really see an Eldil. Does it have a body? And Ransom tries to give the Sorn some idea of the terrestrial terminology of solids, liquids, gases. It must be one of those three. It listened with great attention. That's not the way to say it, says the Sorn. Body is movement. If it is at one speed, you smell something. At another, you hear a sound. At another, you see a sight. At another, you neither see nor hear nor smell, nor know the body in any way. But mark this small one, that the two ends meet. What do you mean? If movement is faster, then that which moves is more nearly in two places at once. And that's the Eldil. The Eldil are moving with great speed, and so the Eldil are simultaneously in the presence of God and here present. Because it's possible. We can't do that, but they can. So you can be in two dimensions. How is it possible for God to be everywhere and yet invisible to us? So he's defying the idea of modern physics that God must be present in a visible, empirical way in the universe to be present to us. No, that's not true. There's another way of looking at it. Again, just imaginative ways of undermining the assumptions that we bring to the world around us. Now, in chapter 16, he deals with the theory of evolution. And that's, what was the chapter again? Chapter 16. They proceeded the petrified, as they proceeded the petrified, and he's seeing a description or a painting of all of life. And on it, it's not just a portrait of all of life, it's a natural history. So things have changed on this planet in this picture. So there are forests, and out of the stalks when a people that have vanished from the world these many thousand years, they're covered not with a fur but with a coat like mine. Augury's explaining how things have changed even on his own planet. And then finally he gets to they proceeded, the petrified forest grew more numerous, and often for half an hour at a time the whole horizon of the lifeless, almost airless waste blushed like an English garden in summer. They passed many caves where, as Augury told him, Sorns lived. Sometimes a high cliff would be perforated with countless holes to the very top, and unidentifiable noises came hollowly from within. Work was in progress, said the Sorn, but of what kind it could not make him understand. He had a different vocabulary. But they're going up and up and up into a colder and colder place. And then finally, actually that wasn't the painting, sorry, I've misidentified with it. In chapter 17, that's the picture. Many of the pictures he could make nothing of. One that particularly puzzled him showed at the bottom a segment of a circle behind and above which rose 3/4 of a disk divided into concentric rings. It's a Ptolemaic cosmology. Right? These concentric circles, like I put on the overhead a while back. He thought it was a picture of the sun rising behind a hill. Certainly the segment at the bottom was full of Malacandrian scenes, Hrossa in Mel Delorme, Sorns on the mountain edge of the Harandra, and many other things both familiar to him and strange. He turned from it to examine the disk which rose behind it. It was not the sun. The sun was there, unmistakably, at the center of the disk. Note that it's not on the, he's not one of the planets above Earth at the bottom. The sun is now at the center. So it's a different cosmology. It's Ptolemaic, and at the same time the sun's at the center. Like for us, we either have the Copernican cosmology with the sun and the planets revolving around it, or we have the Ptolemaic where there is a harmony and an order and a relation. Well, this seems a combination of the two. So the sun is at the center. At the center of the disk. Round this the concentric circles revolved, and in the first and smallest of these was pictured a small ball on which rode a winged figure, something like Hrossa, but holding what appeared to be a trumpet. The Hrossa are something like archangels, and each one is assigned to a planet. In the next, a similar ball carried another of the flaming figures. This one, instead of even the suggested face, had 2 bulges, which after long inspection, he decided were meant to be the udders or breasts of a female mammal. By the time he was quite sure, he was looking at a picture of the solar system. The first ball was Mercury, the second Venus. And what an extraordinary coincidence, thought Ransom, that their mythology, like ours, associates some idea of the female with Venus. The problem would have occupied him longer if a natural curiosity had not drawn his eyes onto the next ball, which must represent the Earth. When he saw it, his whole mind stood still for a moment. The ball was there, but where the flame-like figure should have been, a deep depression of irregular shape had been cut as if to erase it. Once then, but his speculations faltered and became silent before a series of unknowns. He looked at the next circle, and there was no ball. Instead, the bottom of this circle touched the top of the big segment filled with Malacandrian scenes, so that Malacandra, the planet on which he is seeing this, at this point touched the solar system and came out into a perspective towards the spectator. So it's a zoom. Like that planet gets zoomed out. Now that his mind had grasped the design, he was astonished at the vividness of it. He stood back and drew a deep breath preparatory to tackling some of the mysteries in which he was engulfed. Malacandra then was Mars, the Earth, but at this point a sound of tapping or hammering. And some creature is at work. Anyway, this turns out to be Tholcandra, which is the silent planet. That's 8 pages on from this. And he hears from Hrossa what he had seen. What is this? I may tell you that Ransom, it was sometime, okay, let me just, I'll read this and then we'll finish and I'll pick it up next time. Hrossa describing his planet, and you, Ransom of Tholcandra, creatures of your kind must drop out of heaven into a world. For us, the worlds are places in heaven, the Hrossa. So Hrossa stands in front of him, and at the same time he's in heaven. it's possible for him to be in two places at once. These are places in heaven. But do not try to understand this now. It's enough to know that I and my servants are even now in heaven. They are around you in the skyship no less than they are around you here. Then you knew of our journey before we left Thulcandra? No, Thulcandra is the world we do not know. It alone is outside the heaven, and no message comes from it. Ransom was silent, but Oyarsa answered his unspoken questions. It was not always so. Once we knew the Oyarsa of your world. He was brighter and greater than I. And then we did not call it Thulcandra. It was the longest of all the stories and the bitterest. He became bent. It's the account of Satan. He became bent. This was before any life came on your world. Those were the bent years of which we still speak in the heavens. When he was not yet bound to Thulcandra, but free like us. It was in his mind to spoil other worlds besides his own. He smote your moon with his left hand, and with his right he brought the cold death on my Harandra before its time. This is why this world is all going to die. It's hit beyond his world. I'll have to pick it up next time. I will pick it up right there because I think I can't overlook it. It has significance for not just this story but the next one, so I will pick it up next time. Okay.